we have something very special to show you. It's a major discovery that for the last 2,000 years has been lying buried beneath volcanic rock and ash, and you are going to be the first people to see this.
When archaeologists uncovered what experts are calling Britain's Pompeii in the wetlands of eastern England, they found something that shouldn't exist: a Bronze Age settlement frozen in a single catastrophic moment, preserved so completely that wooden bowls still held their last meals and threads remained attached to ancient bobbins. To the untrained eye, it looks like a mud bath, but to experts, this Fenland quarry pit is a unique glimpse into life in Britain 3,000 years ago. This perfectly preserved ancient settlement beneath the sand has left scientists struggling to explain how an entire community vanished in flames 2,850 years ago, leaving behind secrets that are rewriting everything about Bronze Age Britain. The lost city found beneath the fenlands of Cambridge holds answers about a civilization we barely understood until now. The daytime stopped. Chris Wakefield stood in the excavation trench, staring at timber that should have rotted away 2,850 years ago. The wood was charred and blackened by fire, but preserved perfectly by oxygen-starved wetlands. Every axe mark looked fresh, grooves so sharp they caught the light as if the carpenter had only just walked away. At first glance, it seemed impossible. Bronze Age sites never look like this. Normally, most Bronze Age excavations offer shadows in the dirt where wooden posts once stood. If the conditions were favorable, perhaps some pottery fragments could be found. A pit of animal bones if luck smiled. But what emerged from the peat of eastern England broke every rule they knew. 4 roundhouses stood preserved with their walls still intact. Tools hung exactly where owners had left them. A wooden spoon sat in a bowl of half-eaten porridge. The ancient settlement found in Britain delivered something archaeologists dream about but rarely see. Every object, every surface seemed locked in motion, a complete snapshot of daily life frozen in time. Wakefield, part of the 55-person Cambridge Archaeological Unit team, called the discovery archaeological nirvana. The $1.4 million excavation revealed a settlement built on stilts above a slow-moving river in the fenlands of Cambridge. Each roundhouse measured roughly 538 square feet, with walls of woven branches plastered with clay and roofs thatched with reeds. The building stood approximately 6.5 feet above the riverbed, surrounded by a defensive fence of sharpened wooden posts that ringed the entire settlement. Everything about the design spoke of confidence, a people who believed their world was secure. But it wasn't. Sometime around 850 BC, in the heat of late summer, the settlement caught fire. Flames tore through the tightly packed houses in minutes. Residents fled with nothing. Lambs trapped in their pens were burned alive. The heat was so intense that timber posts charred within minutes. Then, as the structures collapsed into the water below, wet mud smothered the fire and sealed everything beneath an oxygen-free environment that prevented decay. The same disaster that destroyed the settlement also preserved it. For nearly 3 millennia, the perfectly preserved ancient settlement waded beneath layers of peat and sediment. When 20th-century quarrying finally exposed part of the site, archaeologists discovered something that would shock experts and rewrite the history books. This wasn't just another Bronze Age excavation. This was Britain's answer to Pompeii, a complete community preserved in the moment of catastrophe.
The comparison to Pompeii wasn't an exaggeration. The Roman city, frozen in time by volcanic ash in AD 79, revealed unparalleled information about ancient life as it captured a single moment across an entire community. Most farms did the same. The British archaeology discovery showed how families organized their homes, what they ate for breakfast, where they stored their tools, and what they were doing in their final moments before disaster struck. The level of preservation was unprecedented for Bronze Age Britain. The excavation's findings shook the archaeological community. The sophistication of the architecture, the abundance of possessions, and the quality of craftsmanship, everything pointed to a society far more advanced than traditional assumptions suggested. The lost city, found near Peterborough, was about to force experts to reconsider everything they thought they knew about life in 9th century BC Britain. The breakfast that never finished. Inside one of the roundhouses, archaeologists discovered a pottery bowl with the fingerprints of its maker still imprinted in the clay. The bowl contained the remains of a wheat grain porridge mixed with animal fat. A wooden spoon lay beside it. Someone had been eating breakfast when the fire started. They set down the spoon, fled the building, and never returned. It was the kind of discovery that makes time collapse. You can feel the person who last touched it. Chemical analysis of residues inside other pottery vessels showed a shocking discovery: traces of honey mixed with deer meat. These families weren't just boiling grain and hoping for the best. They were seasoning their food, combining flavors to create what researchers described as a prehistoric version of honey-glazed venison, a dish no one expected from Bronze Age Britain, created nearly 2,800 years before modern recipes would rediscover the same combination. Across the settlement, the evidence of daily life was everywhere. Archaeologists uncovered 128 ceramic vessels, jars, bowls, cups, and cooking pots, many still stacked or nested as if waiting to be used. The craftsmanship was refined: smooth walls, symmetrical rims, and decorative patterns matching those found hundreds of miles away. Wooden artifacts survived too, perfectly preserved in the wetland mud. Boxes and bowls carved from willow and maple still held their shape. 40 bobbins lay where weavers left them, threads still attached. 15 buckets, scattered across the houses, told their own stories. One flipped and scarred from use as a cutting board, a small improvisation frozen in time. Each object whispered a tiny story of daily life interrupted. Together, they built a portrait not of ruins, but of a living household caught mid-motion. Wakefield said, "Every detail, from a bucket used as a cutting board to a spoon left mid-meal, made the past feel disturbingly alive. Textiles woven from flax linen had a soft, almost velvety texture, despite being underwater for millennia. Seams were neat and even, hems were carefully finished. Though individual garments couldn't be identified, the quality of the fabric was undeniable. These weren't rough, primitive cloths." The perfectly preserved ancient settlement contained textiles that required significant skill and time to produce. Not everything served practical purposes. 49 glass beads decorated the site, some imported from as far as Denmark and Iran. Amber beads added golden accents. A human skull, rendered smooth from touch, sat among household items, possibly a memento of a lost loved one.
The presence of these objects humanized the Bronze Age village in the UK in ways that fragments from other sites never could. The waste piles beneath where the houses stood told their own story. Ancient excrement showed the community kept dogs that fed on table scraps. Human coprolites contained evidence of intestinal worms, a common affliction in the Bronze Age. Animal bones from meals revealed a diet rich in lamb, deer, and other game. It was as if the people had just stepped outside. Every groove in the timber, every spoon in a bowl, blurred the line between past and present. For archaeologists, this was no longer an excavation. It was a haunting encounter with the moment ordinary life stopped. 9 months that changed everything. The thin layer of refuse revealed something that stunned the team. The settlement had existed for less than a year. Minimal waste, green timber, and the absence of insects proved it. This entire city had lived and died in under 12 months. The timeline stunned the research team. How could a community build something so advanced, so complete in under a year? The answer forced archaeologists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about Bronze Age society. Each of the 4 preserved roundhouses contained nearly identical toolkits: sickles for harvesting grain, axes for chopping wood, gouges for carving, handheld razors sharp enough to cut hair or cloth. These weren't heirlooms or luxury items. They were everyday tools for ordinary families. Bronze, once thought scarce, was everywhere. Trade networks had to be strong, fast, and efficient to supply this much material so quickly. The city demonstrated that Bronze Age families could establish complete households in under a year. They built sophisticated homes on stilts. They acquired quality tools and cooking vessels. They imported luxury goods from across Europe. They wove fine textiles and created comfortable living spaces. Archaeologists realized they weren't looking at a struggling frontier village, but a thriving mobile society capable of founding new settlements at will. The snapshot that changed archaeology. When the final report was released, even veteran archaeologists were stunned. Mike Parker Pearson, professor of British later prehistory at University College London, called both the site and the research report exceptional. The fire that had devastated the inhabitants has also given modern science its greatest gift: a perfect snapshot of life frozen mid-motion. Most Bronze Age sites blur time. Centuries of occupation compressed into confusing layers. Must Farm, however, captured a single moment across multiple households with unprecedented clarity. The 1600 8-page research report, published after years of analysis, detailed findings that overturned traditional views of Bronze Age Britain. The authors noted that typical assumptions about artifact accumulation needed revision. Bronze tools and glass beads appeared more common than experts had imagined. Their availability might not have been restricted to elite classes. The distribution of goods across all 4 roundhouses was remarkably even, suggesting a more egalitarian society than previously thought. What they found at Britain's Pompeii didn't just show how people lived, it showed how they thought.
This wasn't a world of strict hierarchy or scarcity. It was a network of skilled families sharing resources, techniques, and wealth. The perfectly preserved ancient settlement allowed researchers to reconstruct interior spaces with unusual precision. They plotted positions of every pot, loom weight, tool, and even sheep droppings. Kitchen areas occupied the eastern sections where morning light filtered in. Storage and weaving areas filled the southern and southeastern portions of the site. Lambs were penned in designated spaces. Sleeping areas occupied the northwestern sections furthest from cooking fires and livestock. It was a floor plan of a lost world, precise enough to feel like memory. Knight said their design was confident, and the architecture proved it. The circular architecture of the roundhouses served multiple purposes. It distributed the weight evenly across the supporting posts. It shed rainwater efficiently. It maximized interior space while minimizing materials needed for construction. The discovery showed that Bronze Age architects had refined this design over generations, creating structures perfectly suited to Finland conditions. The square entranceway structure presented different engineering challenges. Built to allow access while maintaining the defensive perimeter, it required precise joinery and careful planning. The sharpened post fence that surrounded everything stood 6.5 feet tall, enough to deter intruders and protect against wildlife. These weren't primitive shelters thrown together hastily. They were carefully designed homes built to last. The fact that all this sophistication existed in a settlement less than a year old revolutionized the understanding of Bronze Age capabilities.
If families could establish such comfortable, well-equipped homes so quickly, the social organization and economic system supporting them must have been remarkably efficient. What remained unclear was why no one returned after the fire. The site sat abandoned for nearly 3 millennia. Residents who fled had invested months building these homes. The foundations remained solid. New structures could have been built in the same location. They didn't. If these families built so well, so fast, what terrified them enough never to come back? The spears that raised questions? The answer may have been waiting in the ash. Near one of the roundhouses, archaeologists uncovered a stack of spears. Each shaft measured over 10 feet long, far longer than weapons needed for hunting. These were combat spears. Their presence introduced a darker element to the story of the Bronze Age village in the UK. Warfare was common in Bronze Age Britain. Competing groups fought over territory, resources, and control of trade routes. The sharpened fence that once surrounded the settlement already hinted at danger. A defensive ring of stakes standing 6 feet tall, meant to keep out whatever lurked beyond the water. The spears only deepened the mystery. Were they part of the villagers' own defenses or the weapons of their attackers? To find out, the Cambridge team brought in a forensic fire investigator to analyze burn patterns and determine how the blaze started and spread. Every charred beam, every fallen post told a part of the story. The direction of the burn, the temperature gradients, the collapse patterns, all examined in microscopic detail. If the fire had been deliberate, there would be signs: accelerants, concentrated heat zones, evidence of structural sabotage. But none appeared. There was no proof of arson, no broken defenses, no traces of battle. Most Bronze Age excavations recover only 10 or 20 pieces from a 500-piece puzzle, forcing researchers to piece together the complete picture. Muss Farm gave them 250 to 300 pieces, an unprecedented amount of information. But they still couldn't determine definitively what started the fire. Yet, what they did find was no less chilling. The evidence shows that residents had fled in extreme haste. Nothing was packed. No valuables were recovered from the flames. The wooden spoon sat in a half-eaten bowl of porridge. Tools hung undisturbed on walls. The lambs died trapped in their pens, unable to escape. If the fire had started slowly, someone would have released the animals. The speed of the disaster suggested flames spread rapidly, possibly helped by dry timber and thatched roofs in late summer conditions. Where the violence actually struck Muss Farm remains unknown. No battle debris littered the site. No human remains showed signs of trauma. No evidence of forced entry or struggle emerged from the excavation. The fire could have been purely accidental: a cooking mishap, a fallen lamp, or a spark from a hearth catching dry thatch. The complete abandonment of the site might simply reflect survivors choosing to rebuild elsewhere rather than face the trauma of returning.
Not the crude hunting weapons typical of local finds, but finely balanced, battle-ready arms designed for human conflict. Why would a peaceful farming community possess so many? Were they preparing for war or running from one? No human remains showed signs of trauma. No footprints or drag marks suggested invasion. And yet, the presence of so many combat weapons beside untouched homes made one thing clear: these people lived with fear. Perhaps the fire wasn't started by enemies, but by accident, in a moment of tension, a spark caught in the reeds. Perhaps the fear that drove them to arm themselves also drove them to flee and never return. We may never know. But those stacked spears, resting silently beneath centuries of peat, still raise the question every archaeologist dreads. Was this the moment peace in Bronze Age Britain finally broke? Glass from Iran, amber from Denmark. When the ash settled, the story that emerged wasn't one of isolation, it was one of connection. The luxury goods scattered through the burned roundhouses told a story that reached far beyond the fenlands. A necklace found among the debris contained glass beads manufactured in Iran and amber pieces that originated in northern Europe. These materials traveled thousands of miles before arriving at a Bronze Age home in eastern England. That single necklace proved what no one had imagined. Bronze Age Britain was part of a global trade network long before history recorded it. The perfectly preserved settlement showed how far those connections reached. These weren't isolated villages struggling in primitive conditions. They were connected nodes in a vast exchange system that facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and materials across Europe and into Asia. A family living on stilts above a slow-moving river could obtain glass crafted in workshops halfway across the known world. The beads represented more than decoration. They were currency, status symbols, and proof of connections to distant places. The presence of 49 glass beads at Must Farm suggested these items weren't rare treasures hoarded by elites. They circulated widely enough that ordinary households could acquire them within months of establishing residence. Bronze tools found in every roundhouse told a similar story. Copper and tin, the components of bronze, don't occur naturally together. Creating bronze required obtaining metals from different sources, transporting them to specialized workshops, and combining them through metallurgical processes that required significant skill. The fact that every household in the ancient city owned multiple bronze tools indicates that these trade networks functioned reliably and efficiently. Even the pottery styles at Must Farm exhibited influences from other regions. Certain vessel shapes and decoration patterns matched those found hundreds of miles away in different parts of Britain and on the continent. Ideas traveled along with physical goods, spreading techniques and designs across the Bronze Age world. A potter in Cambridge might have incorporated motifs seen on vessels that arrived through trade, blending local traditions with foreign influences. The implications overturned everything scholars believed about Bronze Age society. If a settlement occupied for less than a year could accumulate luxury items from Iran and Denmark, these goods weren't confined to elite circles. They moved through society with surprising freedom. The social hierarchies that archaeologists had previously imagined for Bronze Age Britain, rigid class structures with wealth concentrated at the top, would now require a fundamental revision. The discovery at Must Farm demonstrated that 9th century BC communities lived with a level of comfort and access to goods that previous excavations had only hinted at. What the fire preserved wasn't just a village, it was a snapshot of a connected world centuries before the term civilization ever reached Britain. But for all their access to distant goods, what truly set these people apart wasn't what they traded, it was what they built. Because long before the fire, before the smoke rose over the fen, these families had already solved the problem that would challenge engineers for millennia: how to build a permanent home on water. The architecture of survival. Must Farm wasn't carved into rock or anchored on firm ground. It was floating. Each home stood on posts driven deep into the riverbed. The builders understood load distribution and the physics of shifting currents. They knew how to select timber that would resist rot in constantly wet conditions. They calculated the spacing between support posts to prevent sagging or collapse. This wasn't trial and error. The builders had refined engineering knowledge that was passed down through generations and adapted to specific conditions. The circular roundhouses they built were architectural marvels of the Bronze Age. Their shape evenly distributed stress, shed rainwater efficiently, and trapped warmth inside. Even in modern tests, this design performs better than many square structures. What archaeologists once dismissed as primitive huts were in reality the result of refined experimentation, structures shaped by both necessity and genius. Mark Knight emphasized the confidence these Bronze Age builders displayed in their engineering. They had a blueprint that worked beautifully in waterlogged landscapes. As the climate changed during the Bronze Age, expanding wetlands across Britain, these groups didn't abandon their productive territories. They rose above it, literally. The innovative solutions they developed enabled them to stay and thrive, mastering a way of life that turned danger into defense.
The perfectly preserved ancient settlement revealed construction details rarely visible in common archaeological sites. Wattle and daub walls showed precise weaving patterns. Posts bore axe marks, indicating where builders shaped them for specific purposes. Joints between structural elements demonstrated sophisticated carpentry. The people who built Must Farm possessed technical knowledge equal to any medieval carpenter and applied it with impressive results. Inside each roundhouse, families created distinct activity zones comparable to rooms in modern homes. Kitchen areas in the eastern sections caught the morning light. Storage and weaving areas occupied the southern portions, where natural light remained strong throughout the day. Sleeping areas filled the northwestern sections, positioned away from cooking fires and the noise of livestock. The organization of space showed thoughtful planning and attention to daily routines. Even their defenses were engineered. A square entranceway built to control access while maintaining the sharpened post fence surrounding the settlement. The builders created a solution that balanced accessibility with security, evidence of careful design work rather than improvised construction. What this revealed to archaeologists was astonishing. Bronze Age builders in the Fenlands possessed sophisticated technical knowledge and applied it effectively. The designed homes at Must Farm stood for months and might have lasted years if not for the fire. The engineering was sound. The materials were adequate. The design was proven. These families knew exactly what they were doing. The structures they left behind still whisper of a people who didn't just survive the Bronze Age, they mastered it. They mastered their world. But what they couldn't master was fate. The skull that made it personal. Among the pottery, tools, and daily possessions, archaeologists discovered something that stopped them in their tracks. A human skull, rendered smooth by centuries of handling, sat among household items. This wasn't a burial. This was a keepsake, kept close by people who touched it regularly, who valued it as a connection to someone they'd lost. That discovery changed everything. Suddenly, the settlement wasn't just evidence of engineering brilliance or economic systems, it was personal. Behind every tool, pot, and textile were real people who loved, grieved, and remembered. They kept physical mementos of lost family members. They touched those reminders often enough to wear the bones smooth. They felt loss across the centuries in ways immediately recognizable to modern observers. During the excavation, Mark Knight felt as if the Bronze Age residents had only just left. The fingerprints pressed into pottery. The distance of 2,850 years collapsed. The people who lived at Must Farm became real in profound ways. The skull reinforced that sense of connection. That one object made it impossible to see them as distant ancestors. The ancient city contained thousands of artifacts that revealed technical details and economic systems. But the skull revealed something equally important: emotional life. Bronze Age families formed attachments strong enough to keep physical mementos after death. They incorporated those mementos into their homes rather than burying them in distant cemeteries. They touched them regularly, wearing the bones smooth through repeated contact. This single object transformed how researchers thought about the community at Must Farm. They weren't just studying construction techniques, they were studying people whose emotional lives looked remarkably familiar. The specifics of technology changed over millennia. The fundamental human experiences of love, loss, and memory remained constant. The perfectly preserved ancient settlement offered glimpses of Bronze Age humanity that previous excavations couldn't provide. The combination of exceptional preservation and catastrophic
Abandonment created a time capsule of domestic life. Researchers could see how families organized space and stored possessions. They could reconstruct daily routines and seasonal patterns. The skull added depth to that picture. It showed how people processed grief and maintained connections to the dead. Other luxury items found at the site included the glass beads from Iran and amber from Denmark. These objects represented wealth and connections to distant places. They showed participation in vast trade networks and access to manufactured goods. They revealed economic prosperity and social status. The skull represented something different:
personal meaning that transcended material value. Britain's Pompeii excavations succeeded in making the Bronze Age feel accessible in ways academic studies rarely achieve. The technical findings revolutionized understanding of the period's economics and daily life. The human details, the meals interrupted, the keepsakes cherished, the lives ended by catastrophe, made those findings emotionally resonant. The skull served as a bridge across millennia, connecting modern observers to people who lived radically different lives but felt fundamentally familiar emotions. It reminded everyone that behind all the data and analysis were real human beings whose lives mattered. What surprised you most about life in Bronze Age Britain? Do you think other Bronze Age villages in the UK lie hidden beneath the fenlands, waiting for discovery?